Hey guys, Chris here. So summer is coming up, and when you think of summer, you think of summer camp. And at summer camp, there's always outdoors, activities, friends, and scary stories. And we tend not to think that these scary stories are real. Well, in this case, the stories are real. That's next. So our story takes place in the Black Hills of South Dakota in 2003. There's a summer camp there called Camp Bob Marshall. It's fairly remote in the forested Black Hills outside of Custer. So this camp was built in the 1930s by the CCC, which is a Civilian Conservation Corps. So it's a pretty old camp, but they're still in operation. And in fact, their website says conservation, leadership, and fun. So this is why the kids go out here to this camp in South Dakota in the Black Hills National Forest. And this is where Daniel was working in August of 2003. He was in charge of 6 kids in this one cabin, 6 boys. And they were having a great week and nothing was going wrong. And then one night they had a staff meeting just for the counselors. It was 11 o'clock at night, and the boys, the kids, were supposed to be asleep. Daniel was at this meeting. Meeting's over, and he's coming back to the cabin with the other counselors, and they go off one at a time to their own cabins, and the cabins are all dark, and Daniel's is the last one on the left before the forest, and he notices the front light is on the cabin, and you can see in the windows there's light, and the boys were supposed to be asleep. So he walks up on the small deck and opens the door, but it was locked. And so he started knocking on the door, and then he looked in the window in the front door. There's a small window there, and he could see that the beds had been moved, and he couldn't see the boys. And he looked straight through the cabin, and he could see another window on the back side of the cabin, and he saw movement go by this window. Something huge moved right by this window, and he was trying to understand what he was looking at, and then he saw this face staring back at him from the back side of the cabin to the front side where he was. And this face was like this. It went, and you could see these dark shoulders, it looked like, and just this face, and before he could figure out what it was, it got up and it moved away. It was gone. He kept knocking, and he was feeling this anxiety, not just for himself, but for the kids. And finally, one of the boys opened the door, and he could tell the boy was frightened. And he could hear the other boys over there talking, and they sounded very anxious as well. And he didn't want to tell them what he had just seen. He didn't want to scare them anymore. And so he walked in the middle of these beds that had been pulled together. And they were pulled almost like in a circle, like in the old Westerns, where they circled the wagons to build like a fortress to protect themselves. Well, this is what the boys did with these beds. They pulled them away from the windows, and they were all huddled in the middle of this cabin. And he walked in there, and they were glad to see him. And you could tell they were very frightened. And he said, "What is going on here? What's happened?" And they all started talking at the same time. And then he said, whoa, stop. So why don't you tell me what happened? And then one of the boys stood up and he said, "After you left, about 20 minutes or so, we started hearing rocks hit the back of the cabin, and even some small rocks hit the window. And then we heard sounded like tree branches hitting, because it didn't have the same sound, or sticks hitting the back of the cabin. And so 2 of the older boys assumed it was the other boys in another cabin messing with them. And so they got up and said, all right, we're going to go take care of this. We're going to get these guys back." And so they opened up the back door of the cabin, and we're kind of moving a little bit apart like this, looking and listening for these other boys. They assumed they were going to hear some laughing, giggling, maybe hear some kids running away, and they didn't hear anything. So they both walked towards the tree line, and they started separating a little bit like this. And the tree line was about 15, maybe 20 feet behind this cabin. And they're standing there looking into the darkness. They can see the trees because of the light from the cabin, but it's pretty dim. And then they hear some movement in the brush in front of them. They're assuming it's one or two of the boys. And as they're standing there, all of a sudden they see this large shape, this human-like shape, stand up like this from behind the brush. It just stood up really slow and really deliberate. And they could see these large shoulders and this smallish head. And the light from the cabin gave just enough light on the face to show glint in the eyes. And this thing was just standing there, towering over these boys, staring at them. It was about 12 feet away. They were frozen with fear, staring at this, not even sure what they're looking at. And just for a few moments, they're staring at it, and it's staring back at them. And then they both, at the same time, just turned and ran back into the cabin, slammed the door, locked it, and came running in. And the other boy said, "What? What did you see?" The younger boy couldn't even speak. The older one said, I don't know. We saw a man in the woods, but he was massive. He was huge. And this huge man looked more like a monster. And so we ran. And then one of the other boys said, I've heard about this in the Black Hills. This is called the Tall Man. There's stories about this. In fact, a couple years ago, this is the boy talking now, there was a 12-year-old boy fishing on a pond in the Black Hills early one morning. He was catching rainbow trout, and he hooked one, and as he was reeling it in, he was looking out towards the lake, and he heard a loud splash off to his right. And he looked and he saw a wake for that something was just jumped into the lake or made some movement in the water. And he assumed it was either a beaver or a deer. And he's reeling in this fish, and the fish went in that direction. And then all of a sudden, his line, something big tugged on it and started moving out in the opposite direction. And he was losing the drag here, and he was trying to reel it up. And he kept pulling, and then all of a sudden, it just stopped. It went dead. And then he looked in the lake about 30 feet out. This large, human-like shape stood up in the water and was now staring at him, covered in hair and dripping with water. This little 12-year-old boy dropped his fishing rod and ran. That was the story. That was maybe more lore than more legend or whatever. And the other boys that heard this from this boy that was telling it, they were now totally freaked out. And then the counselor, Daniel, tried to calm the boys down and said, okay, you're going to be okay. I'm with you now. It'll be fine. And then the boys insisted that the lights stay on the front and back of the cabin, and that the doors were locked, and also that the wood stove kept going all night. And they closed whatever curtains they could, and they pushed the beds in even tighter, and they got through the night. But these boys were extremely frightened, and Daniel saw something as well through the window. So the next morning, the counselor gets up, and he goes out the back of the cabin, and he found some branches that were about the size of a baseball bat in width from the pine trees. There were broken branches laying in the back of the cabin. And so for the rest of the week, according to Daniel, he said whenever the boys would have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, there was an outhouse, they would sprint out to the outhouse and then back. They would run as fast as they could if they had to go to the bathroom. And so that is our first story from Camp Bob Marshall. This next story is very short, but it's very frightening. A couple years earlier from the previous story, there was a male counselor. His name was Steve, and he was working for this Camp Bob Marshall. He was by himself in this cabin. Late one night, he went to sleep in the lower bunk, and this bunk was against the back wall of the cabin, and there was a row of bunk beds going down the back of this cabin. His head was towards the side wall of the cabin, and his feet were aimed towards the front door of the cabin, which was in the middle of the cabin. He's laying there in his bed, and he heard someone walk up the front step, the wooden step. There was a small light on the front of the cabin. He couldn't see it from the angle, but the door slowly opened up, and on the other side of the door, he assumed there was going to be another counselor step in the cabin. He was shocked to see a large bipedal creature step into the cabin, and he could see just enough of it because of the light out front. You could see that it was hair covered, and this Bigfoot went from bunk to bunk, smelling each bed, and it worked its way down the opposite direction from Steve, and then slowly turned and came back his direction. And he pretended to sleep as this thing approached his bed, and he could hear it breathing while it was standing over him, watching him. He laid like that for 30 or more seconds, pretending to sleep until he heard this thing slowly walk away, and then he heard some movement on the front porch, the steps, and then it was quiet. And when he knew this thing was gone, or at least he felt its presence was gone, he got up and immediately went towards the door, and the door was left open. He closed the door, locked it, and then he went to the window, the side window, and looked out to see if he could see it, and he saw nothing. He looked around the camp, and the camp was dark, and he was hoping to go to another cabin to be with people. So he reluctantly went back to bed, laid there the rest of the night, could not sleep, and the next morning, it was his last week, and he decided to leave early, and that was the last time he worked there. Now the camp called him back the next season and asked him if he could work for them again, because they were looking for counselors, and he said no. This next story is from another counselor. It was a female. Her name was Jess, and Jess had been working there for half the summer. She said they were on the front porch of the mess hall one evening. It was after sundown, just hanging out talking with her friends, and they heard down the valley towards the lake coyotes yipping, howling, barking. But what was interesting, it sounded like the coyotes were moving because the sound could be heard moving through this valley. But what was scary was behind this coyotes yipping was this screaming sound. And it seemed to be following with the coyotes. And they were moving and moving fast. And they seemed to be coming towards the camp. They're listening to this, and from behind the mess hall, they heard this loud, what sounded like a group of children crying in unison. Really creepy. And this sound echoed around the mess hall and through this valley. When this happened, the coyotes, the yipping and barking stopped, and this moaning, crying sound from behind the mess hall went on for another 15 seconds. And then mid-echo, this sound stopped, and it stopped very unnatural. The girls were sitting on the front porch, and they were in awe by what they had just heard. Very chilling and very frightening. They did not know what it was, but they had been there all summer, and it didn't match up to anything they knew of. So they decided it was best to turn in and go to their cabins for the night. And it turned out that was their last night there because their stay at this camp was done. Okay, so our next story takes place in Iowa. Iowa, in the upper Midwest, of all places, is not known as a Bigfoot state. But there's been a few encounters people have had in Iowa. It's a fairly flat state, a lot of cornfields, but there are river bottoms, forests, and in the east along the Mississippi River, there's bluff country. Really great country. And so in 2012, this is where Jamie, he was 10 years old, living with his family along the Raccoon River. They had a 20-acre property that had some river access, as well as forest. And the Raccoon River is west of Des Moines, a little bit north in that area. On this property, they had their home and they had a small cabin that the kids would stay in during the summer. And they also built a fire pit off in the forest. And they liked to go out there in the evenings regularly with the kids and have campfires. This particular night, it was July 2012, they had their aunt and their cousins, mom and dad, and then Jamie was out there. Got the fire going, they're hanging out, having a good time. They're doing s'mores, and they also did the pie makers with the bread, and you put the pie filling in them, cooking those in the fires, and we did those growing up as kids as well. A lot of fun, if you've never done that. And they heard off in the forest some sounds. Thumps, knocks, tree knocks, stomps, and branch breaking. Just periodically, just enough, it's like around them in this direction, kind of towards the river. And being it was their own property and they were out there several nights that summer and they're very comfortable on their own property, they didn't really think much of it. They'd heard deer on their property before, they've seen deer, and so they didn't stop and go, hey guys, listen to that. They just continued on with what they were doing. And they're all chatting. It was pretty loud anyways with the kids and all of them by the campfire. After about an hour of this, Jamie, being 10 years old, he wanted to go see what he thought was the deer. And he'd seen deer before on their own property. And he walks about 10 yards away from the campfire. And as a kid growing up, being by the campfire and then going even 10 feet feels like a long ways because it gets dark very quickly as you move away from the campfire when it's pitch black out and you're in the forest. And so he went 10 yards, which is 30 feet. It's a long ways to go by yourself in the forest without a flashlight. But he's very comfortable. It's his own property. He's been there during the day, obviously, night, camping on the property, fishing, and he just felt very comfortable. He walks out, and he's in this grass about 2 feet tall. He's headed towards the river. And the weirdest thing, something got up in front of him and ran from left to right really quickly, and it was very dark and about waist high. So waist high for a 10-year-old isn't very tall, but he said it wasn't long like a deer. It was more like shaped like a person almost. But it was so quick and so fast, and it just went from left to right really suddenly. Startled him, but again, his mind is still thinking some kind of an animal that he knows. It drew his attention this way as it went, and then he saw about 10 feet away this large bipedal shape standing there, staring at him. And whatever this small thing was, it just was so fast, it was just gone. It just disappeared. And now he's staring at this large shape that's looking down at him, very broad shoulders, and he saw a glint of red where the eyes were, and this thing was motionless, and they stared at each other for about 10 seconds. And Jamie said, it felt more like 10 minutes. He was just petrified, speechless, he couldn't talk, and he's staring at this thing, and then slowly and quietly it turned, and he said it had this really weird turn. I don't know if it meant the shoulders went like this, or the arms had kind of a weird movement, the legs had kind of weird, but it just turned and just walked off, and it walked off really with no sound. Absolutely quiet. In the branches and the grass and the trees, it just made no sound, and it just quickly disappeared into the darkness. And he's standing there just for a moment, maybe just a handful of seconds, 4 or 5 seconds, just frozen. And then it kicked in the fear and the survival stuff kicked in, fight, flight, or freeze, he was choosing flight, or his body was. And he turned and he ran back towards the campfire, continued running, and ran to the cabin, shut the door, and didn't come out until the next day. Now his mom saw him run by the campfire and head to the cabin, and she waited a few minutes, and then she went up to the cabin to check on him. Comes in the cabin, asked Jamie, "Hey, I saw you run in the cabin. Are you okay? What's going on?" And he wasn't sure what to say because he wasn't really sure what he saw. And so he said, "I think the cousins played a prank on me and it really scared me." And he didn't want to elaborate on that. But he knows what he saw. It was very clear what he saw. It wasn't clear like as in daylight clear, but he clearly saw these shoulders and this head. He said it had a pointed head and just barely enough light on it. He really did not to see any details, but he knows it was not a prank. So it was almost like the reality of what he was looking at, his mind did not want to accept that reality. And so his mind was thinking, oh, it's got to be a prank. It's got to be a prank because I don't want to accept the reality here. But he didn't tell his mom that. He just said, "I'm okay. I'm just done for the night." The kids scared me. Wakes up the next day. It's nice and sunny out. It's July. Goes to the campfire where it was, the fire pit. He's looking, doesn't see any tracks, doesn't see anything. And he's not sure what to think about it, but he knows he saw something. And then he said, 2 months later, him and his dad were fishing at the pond. They had a pond on this property. And they found a footprint, a 15-inch long footprint in the grass, mud near the pond. And he took a picture of it. And then he said 6 months later, him and his dad were camping out for the night. And they heard something in the forest, some movement, similar to what he heard that night by the campfire, but not nearly as much. And then they heard one loud tree knock. And the next morning, they both went out and they found near the river a 20-inch long footprint. Crazy. This is what Jamie had to say. And he's 10 years old. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was huge. I was really scared and couldn't speak. I have no doubt that there is a Sasquatch living on our property, and it may still be living there." And that is our story from a 10-year-old in Iowa. Wow. Pretty wild. And that's in Iowa. This is not Washington State or British Columbia, Iowa. But those river bottoms in places like Iowa, Minnesota, the upper Midwest, they're just thick. The brush and the swamps along these rivers, it's very easy. I could see a large creature like a Bigfoot living in that area. So, all right, you guys, thank you for watching, and I appreciate all your comments, and I appreciate you guys. So thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one. As always, keep hiking.